The families of some of the 179 British troops killed due to the invasion of Iraq in 2003 have said that yesterday's official report confirms their view that they died unnecessarily. The Chilcot inquiry found that peaceful alternatives weren't exhausted before the invasion and that there was no immediate threat from Saddam Hussein or his regime. The report also says planning for after the invasion was wholly inadequate. At the time, MPs voted on whether to back the US-led invasion of Iraq or not. The South Norfolk MP Richard Bacon and the North Norfolk MP Norman Lamb both voted against the invasion, and I'm pleased to say that we can talk to both of them this morning. Let's start with Richard Bacon. Mr. Bacon, very good morning to you.
Good morning.
What is your reaction to this report?
Well, I'm very pleased that it's been so thorough and that it's been so clear. I think many of the families particularly were very worried that it would be some form of whitewash to a greater or lesser degree, and it plainly hasn't been that. At the same time, I feel that it doesn't really tell us that much that's new. That's to say, things that we didn't already know. There were many people at the time who thought that there was no immediate threat from Saddam Hussein. There were many people at the time who thought that the UK was choosing to join the invasion of Iraq before the peaceful options had been exhausted. After all, the motion in the House of Commons, the amendment to the motion, which both Norman and I voted for, was that the case for war is not yet made. I think that was knowable and known by some of us at the time, and it gives me no pleasure at all to say that, given what's happened since. But I think, the facts were there if you chose to look for them.
Norman Lamb, your reaction, please, to the report.
Well, I agree with everything that Richard's just said, and I admire the fact that he stood out against his party, which was a brave thing to do. My distress, given the disastrous consequences of this, is that people didn't listen to brave politicians like Robin Cook, who resigned, and the speech that he made in Parliament made the points that Richard has just made. And yet the Labour government at the time, depressingly supported by the Conservative official opposition, with the exception of people like Richard, voted in favour. And I remember the abuse that our leader, Charles Kennedy, had at the time as he bravely made the case against this war, which we continue to believe was an illegal war. And the consequences for the region and for the world have just been utterly disastrous. And I found watching Tony Blair yesterday painful. I think he's struggling with his conscience to come to terms with the dire consequences of what happened. But I think also the Americans must take an enormous share of the blame here, because I think there's little doubt, and the ambassador has made this point, that the Bush administration and people behind Bush, including Donald Rumsfeld, were pushing the UK to go straight to war without using the United Nations. And what was wrong in the United Kingdom was that Blair, although he may have wanted to go to the United Nations, ultimately went along with the Bush administration, and that had, as we've said, dire consequences.
Richard, how difficult was it going against your party in this decision? There was phenomenal pressure on people to try and toe the line on the issue of Iraq, but you stood up and said no.
It was difficult. It wasn't as difficult as you might think. The most startling point was when I stood up to vote. Of course, I was walking in the opposite direction. In the House of Commons chamber, you can see how people are going to vote because of where they're walking. And I was walking through a sea of my colleagues going the other way, and they were surprised. And that was probably the most difficult part. But in some ways, the decision itself was relatively easy. And every time I had doubts, I just read the emails from my constituents that gave me enormous sustenance, because it was quite obvious to many people, members of the public. I mean, I didn't have sources of intelligence that were not available to other people. I just read the newspapers. I read them very carefully, and so did members of the public, including Norman's and my constituents. To Norman's point about the Americans, I mean, it's interesting the State Department now doesn't want to talk about this at all, and it is the bitterest of bitter ironies that George Bush and indeed Tony Blair, who were very public Christians, have created a situation now where Christians in the Middle East are being slaughtered and are fleeing for their lives. Let's remember that under Saddam Hussein, and I have no brief for Saddam Hussein, he was a monster, but he had a foreign minister, Tariq Aziz, who was a Christian. It was almost of no consequence which religious sect you belonged to or which persuasion you had in those terms in Iraq. It was largely a secular country, and what's happened now is that it's unleashed what has now been unleashed through an unholy combination of the elite Republican Guard, who were forced to flee, but with a lot of money and equipment, and the jihadists, many of them foreign, has been a problem that the whole world is now going to have to deal with for decades to come, and it is a direct consequence of the decisions of Tony Blair and George Bush.
I wanted to... Sorry, go ahead, Norman.
Well, the other disastrous failure was the failure to plan what happened after the invasion. There was a piece in The Guardian yesterday by a woman who went out to help with rebuilding the nation, and what she says is she found chaos when she got there, no proper planning, total inadequate provision for those seeking to try and rebuild the peace. The negligent failure there was just outrageous.
I believe that was Emma Skye, one article that I read.
Yes,
it's very interesting reading.
Very powerful.
Yeah, it was, yeah. I wanted to get both of you onto the radio this morning because there's a lot of people who appear to have been enlightened now after a decade of being able to look back over what happened and to see the consequence of what happened in Iraq, and hindsight is a wonderful thing. But Chilcot said yesterday that he absolutely did not accept that hindsight was necessary. People needed foresight to be able to see what was happening or what could happen in Iraq, and both of you managed to use foresight to predict correctly what has indeed turned out. One of the key points in this report is to try and make sure that this doesn't happen again. Norman first, are you confident that future governments can learn from what happened in Iraq?
I don't think we can ever be sure that mistakes won't happen again. And one of the dire consequences of this war is that sometimes there are humanitarian disasters which require intervention to save people from slaughter. Of course, now we are wholly reticent to get involved in any way because of the fear of repeating the mistake of Iraq. So you have a reaction in the opposite direction. And I think that one of the clear lessons is that the processes within government were totally inadequate, members of the cabinet not being kept informed. But ultimately, Robin Cook saw what was happening, saw that the case hadn't been made, and was brave enough to resign. And you have enormous admiration for someone who was willing to do that.
So it's a speech that's definitely worth watching again, when Robin Cook stood up and explained to the House why he was standing down, and that amazing round of applause that he received afterwards. And actually, very sadly, Robin Cook, of course, died a couple of years later. Richard,
as does Charles Kennedy, sadly. Two brave people.
Absolutely right to point out Charles Kennedy as well, who you're quite right to say stood up against fierce criticism to make the point against the war in Iraq. Richard, finally from you, the lessons that could be learnt here, how confident are you that they will be applied in the future?
Well, you can't always be certain, but I think there are two very important points. Norman alluded to one of them. It is extraordinary that a decision of this magnitude to take this country to war could be taken in informal meetings without formal records being taken. And I think there are serious questions to be asked about the way the civil service did not stand up to ministers and make sure that that never happened. The second thing is that it is important that we don't draw the conclusion, although we've obviously become much more cautious and shy as a result, and probably quite rightly, we don't draw the conclusion that intervention is always wrong, because there are occasions when intervention is necessary. Very regrettably, I thought intervention was necessary in the Falklands. Intervention was necessary in Kuwait after Saddam invaded Kuwait. And normally we've not gone to war unless faced with a clear act of aggression. And what was very clear in Kuwait was that the West spent a very great deal of time building the right international coalition so that there was worldwide support for what was done. And I think it's not a case of never intervening, but making sure that the world acts in concert.
Okay.
And only when we have clear agreement and support from around the world should intervention take place.
Richard and Norman, thank you both for joining us this morning. Greatly appreciated. Norman Lamb, of course, the North Norfolk MP. Richard Bacon, the South Norfolk MP, both who voted against the invasion of Iraq.